Learning to become, learning to learn, learning to thrive, learning to flourish, learning to care.
It is now time to listen to our voices.
To prepare a better future.
Treat others and
the planet as you would wish to be treated.
Collaborating
and develop in partnership.
We have the capacity
to understand,
to take action, to take care of ourselves, others, and the planet.
And we want to invite you
to really work together
and collaborate so that we can have an impact now.
Welcome to Learning Planet Festival.
It can just get better.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone joining us from all around the world. Thank you for being here. My name is Sarah Dalglish, and I'm really pleased to join you today with a fantastic group of panelists to talk about children's health as part of the Learning Planet Festival. So in this panel, this session, we're going to talk about the findings of the WHO UNICEF Lancet Commission and its report, A Future for the World's Children, a question that I know interests everyone who's tuning in today. And we're really hoping that this report laid the foundations for a new global movement to promote child health and well-being. So we'll hope that you will be part of this movement with us. To discuss this topic today, I'm joined by really a great group of speakers. First, we have Almaz Moudali, a student activist from the Broaden School in South Africa. We have Lélia Benoit, a youth psychiatrist with APHP in France, but who's currently in residence at Yale University in the United States. We have Taryn Marks, who's the general manager of AIM, which is an NGO working to eradicate educational inequality, joining us all the way from Australia. We have Alexiane Terrocher, a youth ambassador with a French NGO called La Fève, that also does mentoring with disadvantaged youths. François Tadei, who is the CEO of the Center for Research and Interdisciplinarity in Paris, France. And finally, we have our discussant, Anthony Costello, who is a professor of global health and sustainable development at University College London, UK. So we really have a really diverse group of smart experts and speakers to bring to you new perspectives today. So in this session, I'm first going to give a really brief overview of that report I mentioned, our landmark report on child health, for just about 10 minutes. And then I'm going to ask each of our panelists to provide a few short remarks in their area of expertise for 4 minutes each. And then comes the most important part of this session. And that's when you, the audience and listeners, get to ask your own questions about the links between children's health and our planet, and how all people can work together to preserve both for future generations. So we really want to hear from you. And we've devoted the longest part of the session to that, about 45 minutes. So please put your questions in the chat box, and we'll make sure that they get answered by our brilliant group of panelists. So without further ado, let's get started. I'll first provide, as I said, a brief overview of our report, the report of the UNICEF, WHO UNICEF Lancet Commission. And we're going to share a link to that report in the chat if you want to see the full thing. So this commission, what was it? It brought together more than 40 top experts on child health and well-being from all around the globe. So that's from the World Health Organization, from UNICEF, and from many other universities and centers of expertise on every continent. And our aim really was to bring child health policies into the 21st century and to create the kind of transformational change that we think is needed to ensure that children are protected both today and in the future. So our point of departure was really the following. What did children themselves say was most important for their future? So we asked this question of Indigenous Maori children in New Zealand, of disabled children in Nigeria, of children from a poor community in Argentina, and children in refugee communities in Lebanon. So what's interesting is these are obviously really different groups of children with different needs and different experiences. But interestingly, they all sort of said the same things when it came to what was most important to them and for their future. They said, first of all, family togetherness. They wanted to be with their families. Clean environments. A lot of them talked about being disturbed by polluted or dirty or dangerous environments. They talked about education and culture, wanting to go to school and to be able to participate in cultural activities. And they also talked about wanting to play. And as we know, the right to play is a right that's enshrined for children in international treaties. So as commissioners, we said, this is what children themselves say is most important. It's what they want. What are the biggest obstacles and barriers to making sure that all children have access to these things? So we put our heads together and we came up with 3 main challenges that we thought existed to helping children achieve and receive what they deserve in today's world. The first is the most obvious, it's climate change. We all know this is a huge problem today, but it's a big problem. It's the biggest problem for children because first of all, they have longer lifespans and also they have less of a say in how we deal with climate change today. Children, especially poor children, they're also especially vulnerable to the effects of climate change. So to cite just one example, children exposed to air pollution, even in utero, they're more likely to develop respiratory problems, diabetes, cardiovascular problems, and learning difficulties later in life. So that's already happening today. As we know, climate change is going to bring many more problems in the future if we don't act now. So that's why it's so important to listen to children and to take leadership from them when it comes to climate action, because they're the ones who are most affected by this issue. The second major challenge that we identified in our report has to do with commercial marketing to children and their caregivers. We thought that was an under-recognized threat, and we laid out the problem in some detail. So what do I mean by commercial marketing? Well, children are targeted by commercial entities that make billions in profits by selling products and services that harm children's health and well-being. So that's things like tobacco and alcohol, but also sugar-sweetened beverages, ultra-processed foods and other junk foods, and even things like gambling services that can be really harmful to children's mental health, their schooling, and their relationships. To give you just one example, one multi-country study showed that 2/3 of 5 and 6-year-olds, so those are really little kids, they could recognize at least one cigarette brand. So the marketing is really getting through to them. And that's why we're pushing for both national and transnational regulation to rein in these commercial abuses. The third and final challenge to giving children what they deserve and need is it has to do with how governments function, because for the most part, they don't work across sectors to protect and nurture children's health. So if you want to protect children, obviously the health and education sectors are critical, but you also need housing, transportation, agriculture, trade. You need to make sure all sectors work together so that children are safe and healthy in all aspects of their lives. So we want to bring together stakeholders in countries, all stakeholders, to institutionalize action for children across sectors. And that's really what we mean when we say that children are at the center of the concept of sustainability and of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And that's why we think that it's so important to talk about these issues as part of the Learning Planet Festival. Now, the United Nations says that if we want to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals, and if we want to have a world with peace, security, justice, and climate resilience, that we can only do so by engaging with children and young people. So what concretely does that mean? How do we work with people who, for the most part, don't have the same full legal rights as adults? Well, under international law, children have the right to participate in decisions that affect them. And we know that there are different ways to work with children when we're making decisions about the future. You can, for example, consult them. There are digital tools that can help with that. For example, there's a free app called UReport that's allowed children and young people in over 50 countries to provide input on policies, on health, and other issues. You can also let children and adolescents lead. And we've definitely seen that with the climate action. For example, the Global School Strikes for Climate, which has involved millions of children and adolescents worldwide. But I think that adults still have a lot of work to do to listen to and to engage with children when it comes to making consequential decisions about the future of our world. And I think probably a lot of my fellow panelists will agree, and we'll have some really interesting perspectives on that. So that's enough from me. I encourage you to check out the report if you want to learn more. Now let's hear from our brilliant group of panelists. And we have some questions for them that are going to enrich our discussion. So let's start with Almaz Moudali, a student activist in South Africa. And we'd like to hear from Almaz how, as a young person, how do you feel about climate change? And what has been your experience giving input on different policies and legislation? Over to you.
Thank you for that lovely introduction, Sarah. I would first like to thank everyone that made this event possible and for this opportunity to speak on such a prestigious panel. I think that it's events like these that allow us as young people to not only voice our opinions and make our opinions heard, but to also organize ourselves better on these important topics that will carry far into our adulthoods. To answer your question on how I feel, I think more than anything, I feel hopeful about the future because so many governments and large stakeholders are making commitments to solve the climate crisis. And activists, especially youth activists, are making their voices heard. But then again, I hope that we don't only talk about what needs to be done and start taking action. I also feel anxious because I think that this is a make or break moment for the climate crisis especially. It's essential to take the path to a greener future rather than embracing a world where a certain group of people just get richer and richer with no end. I've had the great privilege of being involved in policy on a provincial and national level. In South Africa, I think we are relatively organized with a few organizations seeking the opinions of young people. For example, we have youth model parliaments and model legislatures where we work together to submit draft resolutions tackling issues such as food security, climate change, COVID-19 in South Africa. These documents then go forward to our legislatures to be included in our policies and regulations. These sessions, I find, are so critical because it's available to youth from all walks of life in South Africa. We all come together with a common goal and share our ideas, and often we see these ideas play out in our society. I've also had the opportunity to work with regulators on an international level. I was part of a panel in the EU Climate Diplomacy Week, where EU ambassadors, European diplomats, government officials, and other large stakeholders all came together to discuss our relatively different opinions on the climate crisis for a full week, so that we would come to a final agreement on our climate change agenda. The key ideas that were carried out in this event was the need for a just green recovery, which I'm glad to say the youth influenced massively. This event culminated in a closing ceremony where I represented the youth opinion on how a just green recovery is poised for success. Something that I've come to terms with, though, is that solving the climate crisis is complex, and that's why we need to frame the agenda in a holistic manner, as outlined in the Children's Health Report Sarah shed light on. We can't talk about climate change without talking about poverty alleviation, without talking about food security, without talking about unemployment. For example, how do you close a factory that's polluting the environment? But whole communities' livelihoods depend on the wages that it provides. The solution to this problem is regulation, with implementable solutions so that businesses can transform themselves into greener businesses, all the while still playing a vital role in their community. Climate change is going to take many generations for us to solve, so it's inevitable that young people will inherit these leadership positions. The youth of today, I know, have so many ideas, and if we just invest more in giving them a voice, properly catering for their safety, health, mental well-being, we are making an investment in our future. And I think that's an investment worthwhile.
Thank you so much, Almaz. Bravo. That is really a fascinating perspective. And I'm sure I'm not the only one who thinks that. I really like the way you talked about taking a holistic perspective and about devoting resources to make sure that young people can be involved. So thank you. And if people listening have any questions for Almaz, please go ahead and put it in the chat. So now let's go to Lelia Benoit. We'd like to hear from Lelia about how, as a psychiatrist, what you think are the most important things you would like adults to understand when talking to children and adolescents about these big issues like climate change. Lelia.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Almaz, for this beautiful testimony. So I would have 3 advices for adults to understand when talking to children and adolescents. So the first advice is allow yourself to talk. Parents, teachers need to know that it's okay to talk about important issues such as climate change. Many parents are reluctant to do so for fear of worrying their children. But history has shown us that in order to enable new generation avoid repeating tragedies, we need to talk to them about difficult truths. Just think about how the Second World War and the Holocaust is explained to children in Western countries. Actually, difficult truths may awaken sadness, fear, and anger, but these emotions are healthy and legitimate. Parents can openly talk about climate change. They are the best supports to show their children how to welcome these emotions without avoiding them. And by engaging with our sense of loss, we become more aware and ready to engage in collective actions. So that is my first advice. The second advice is make things concrete for children. What do we need to know about children? We need to know that before the age of 12 or 13, children do not have abstract thoughts. It is during adolescence that the brain matures and allows us to understand abstraction. So when we explain the climate crisis to children, we need to show them concrete things. For example, a river that has dried up. Children are very sensitive to nature and motivated to protect it. So adults are important role models. Children should be offered concrete and positive and joyful activities, such as planting a tree, for instance. So that is the second advice. The third advice is about adolescents. We need to support adolescents' initiative. Because what do we need to know about adolescents? That even if they are very motivated to engage in ecological actions and that they are taking initiatives, adults need to continue to support them. Because adolescents cannot carry on long-term commitments on their own. They have other things to do. They have to go at school, they have to prepare for the world or for having a job. So they have plenty of things to do. If adults do not support their initiatives, they will feel neglected. So what is being neglected? In psychology, it is said that there are 2 ways for an adult to neglect a child: the obvious neglect and the hidden neglect. So I'll just explain to you a little bit because I think it's very useful to understand climate crisis. So the obvious neglect is to belittle the child, to overlook what he says, to dismiss his opinion, and say that he is not capable of anything. But the hidden neglect is very interesting also. The hidden neglect is to idealize the child, to say that he is so gifted that he will solve all the problems alone. Oh, don't worry, everything is perfect. You know, in both cases, the adult is not involved in supporting and accompanying the child. So regarding the climate crisis, adults and even the media often overlook the needs of adolescents. They neglect them. The obvious neglect in climate crisis occurs when teenagers' ecological actions are not taken seriously. Their views are dismissed. Teenagers are accused of easily shifting their views, their interests from climate change to the newest smartphones. You know, like our teenagers change their mind all the time. It's something that we can hear. So that is an obvious neglect. And what is the hidden neglect? The hidden neglect occurs when young activists are described as heroes who will finally save the planet just by themselves. Look, the new generation arrived. Everything is going to be okay. But what does this tell us? In both cases, adults do not take responsibility. They either blame the younger ones for their limitations, or they see themselves as saviors. By doing so, adults forget that their duty is to provide space, listening, and guidance to the youngest ones, as well as to set an example by their own behavior, and to give teenagers concrete tools to carry out their ecological commitments. So that was my 3 advices.
Thank you so much, Lelia. Really valuable perspective on how adults can take responsibility and how they can appropriately support both children and adolescents in facing these difficult issues, including climate change. And it's so important because we all need to be working together to solve these issues. Thank you. Now let's go to Taryn Marks. Why don't you talk to us about when it comes to preserving the planet for children and future generations, what Indigenous youth in particular bring to the table as part of this discussion? Taryn.
Hello, everybody. Thank you. To start, I'd first like to recognise the Wadawurrung people where I live and work, and I'd also like to acknowledge First Nations peoples all over the lands that we are joining in this discussion. I pay my respect to the elders past and present, and I'd also especially like to honour the future elders, the children and young people. Together, we're all doing the work to support the next generation of elders, that they grow up strong in themselves and fulfil their hopes and dreams and continue to carry the cultures, languages and stories and share these knowledges with the world. I'm from Wotjobaluk country, the Wagaya language group in Western Victoria in Australia. My experience is mostly across social and emotional wellbeing, early childhood development and promoting Indigenous media representation and strategies for increased media literacy. I came to AIM as I so very much believe in the role of the mentor and education as a social determinant of health. At AIM, we inspire young people to flip their own script, to change the narrative they have inherited through social constructs. We believe in giving young people the stage to show that they're not the problem, they're in fact the solution. The learning intended is to rewrite how we look at failure, how we look at ourselves, to cast off shame whilst being taught forgiveness and empathy and caring for those around them and also the world. We teach young people that those within their and then those in their immediate ecosystem to use imagination as the beginning of all thought. We share stories to inspire and provide hope, to create media literacy and access to global knowledges and complex thinking. And we teach young people that they have the power of writing and rewriting their own stories, particularly when looking at significant issues such as inequality and climate injustice. We believe in the power of the mentor and that we are all mentors, but particularly in the voice of young people themselves. AIM's work has been transforming education from the inside and providing more access to opportunities for Indigenous and other young people globally that have historically been marginalised. And it is much art as it is science to unlock their potential to build bridges between them and the opportunities of the world. Following the Uluru Statement of the Heart in 2019, which is central to the Indigenous-led movement to progress constitutional reform in Australia, a group of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander young people gathered in northeast Arnhem Land for a youth forum at Garma Festival hosted by Yothu Yindi Foundation. The forum resulted in a declaration for the Prime Minister and the Education Ministers across Australia called the Imagination Declaration. I've shared the full transcript, but I'll provide some of the words with you today, as I think it summarises it really nicely. Today, we ask you to imagine what's possible. The future of this country lies in all of our hands. We do not want to inherit a world that is in pain. We do not want to stare down huge inequality, feeling powerless to our fate. We do not want to be unarmed as we confront some of the biggest problems faced by the human race, from rising sea levels, which will lead to significant refugee challenges, to droughts and food shortages, and our own challenges around a cycle of perpetuated disadvantage. It's time to think differently. With 60,000 years of genius and imagination in our hearts and minds, we can be one of the groups of the people that transform the future of life on Earth for the good of us all. We can design the solutions that lift islands up in the face of rising seas. We can work on creative agricultural solutions that are in sync with our natural habitat. We can re-engineer schooling, we can invent new jobs and technologies, and we can unite around kindness. We are not the problem, we are the solution. We don't want to be boxed, we don't want ceilings. We want freedom to be whatever a human mind can dream. Expect us to continue carrying the custodianship of imagination, entrepreneurial spirit, and genius. We urge you to give us the freedom to write a new story. We want to show the world Aboriginal genius. We want to show the nation Aboriginal leadership and imagination. So when COVID hit last year in 2020, we could no longer be on school and university campuses. We had to get even more imaginative. In 2 days, AIM turned around a YouTube live stream Imagination TV, bringing the mentors into the homes and on screens of kids every weekday. The show was hosted by the young people themselves, and it centred the mentors and provided access to higher ordered thinking. We've continued reshaping our strategy around imagination and created Imagination University. And this is a free online university that I urge you all to check out on amentoring.com. The students of imagination, the young people and those within their ecosystem will be the scholars of the following areas: of mentoring, the highest order of being, of flipping the script, writing a new narrative for kids being left behind, of building bridges, forging complex, unlikely alliances between people across all backgrounds and other divides, of hoodie economics, where kindness is a currency of exchange and is where you see our very popular hoodie that is worn amongst the young people, of organising change, changing the world by changing the way it works. And I'll leave you with some words of our founder, Jack Manning Bancroft, our founder and Australia's youngest ever honorary doctorate. We believe in a free world, free ideas, free knowledge, free minds. Our ultimate goal is to eventually leave behind an imagination library of tools, from art to books to films, that is free, that humankind built for each other, for today, for tomorrow, for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Taryn, for those extremely stirring words. I think that it leaves a lot to think about, and it shows the power of imagination, as you said, to really address and confront these crises. Thank you so much. Let's go on now to Alexiane, who will also talk to us about mentoring young people from her own experience. So Alexiane, when mentoring young people, what are some challenges that you have faced in speaking to them about important issues like climate change? And what are some solutions or some ways to engage them that you have discovered? Alexiane.
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for all of the inspiring speeches I heard before. First of all, I have a question for all of you. Have you ever had a mentor in your life? Think about it. Sometimes these people do not even say that they are mentors or do not even know. But in any case, they empower their mentee to learn about themselves and to find their voice, to have an active role in today's and tomorrow's society. Basically, I'm going to take a few steps back. Before acting to defend one's convictions about climate change or how to maintain mental health, good mental health, or how to preserve kids' overall health, let's talk about education. Basically, empowering mentees is the main goal AFEV is trying for. Mentoring people who come from disadvantaged backgrounds digitally or face-to-face is a chance to boost mentees' self-confidence, first challenge, to broaden their cultural horizons, second challenge, and to develop their critical thinking, third challenge. These are AFEV's tools to make these mentees become well-informed and curious citizens. Thus, the overarching goal of mentoring someone is also to empower them to make them understand that they have both hard and soft skills to bring to society. As a consequence, these mentees believe that they have the right to contribute to tomorrow's society, that their voice actually matters. So for instance, when I was a mentor, my mentee lacked terribly self-confidence while expressing her opinions. When asked questions about her personal taste or her strengths and weaknesses at school, like do you prefer maths or French subjects, she could not go further than yes or no. With this self-inflicted barrier, how can you ask your mentee to give their opinion on very complex issues such as climate change? So that's a personal barrier she was putting to herself. So we were creative. Through activities such as watching videos about complex issues and very simple issues such as how to learn maths and complex topics where it was like, for instance, how to learn a foreign language. Through creative writing exercises about what she preferred in nature, whether like hugging trees or, I don't know, jumping in very cold water, or online games such as personality quizzes, she slowly constructed her opinions. But then the most important thing was when she was able to argue why she thought that some subjects at school were less important than others, such as, or why it contributed less to her intellectual development. Huge improvement here. But the challenge remained when tackling complex topics such as physical activity, why it was important for her to keep moving, or an even further complex subject such as climate change. The reality of living with many siblings in an apartment which is far away from any natural site, well, this reality complicated mentors' work to raise awareness about a yet crucial topic. So now we're dealing with digital mentoring programs. It is both a means to keep in touch with the mentees when there is a lockdown and preserve one's social life to contribute, partly at least, to a sounder mental health. But it is also an opportunity. Digital mentoring allows mentors and mentees to meet via the phone or via WhatsApp or Messenger or via computer when possible. Mentors are first trained before meeting their mentees, but most importantly, they also expect to work on digital related topics, such as how to make their mentees aware of the dangers of internet or the dangers of social medias or the proliferation of fake news. To conclude, and to answer your question, Sarah, I think that mentoring is a good tool to empower youth. But as you said, challenges remain. It is often difficult to raise awareness about complex issues, which are felt to be far away from either the mentees or the mentor's daily life. Climate change, the dangers of advertisement on unhealthy products such as sugar, or the lack of physical activities, or instances which should be tackled by mentors, but sometimes it is simply too much disconnected from the mentee's reality. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alexiane, for that really interesting intervention. I loved hearing about using digital tools in this new post-COVID world and about some of the challenges, real challenges faced when talking about some of these big issues. Thank you. Let's now go to François. François, we'd like to hear from you about the importance of imagination, and what do you think is the importance of imagination when it comes to involving children in making a better world? François. François, we can't hear you.
Sorry. I think we've already heard some powerful words of the new generation and their will to engage with the various issues that we are discussing, climate, but also, obesity and the various dimensions that your wonderful reports have highlighted. And I think that, for them to be able to understand how they can care for oneself, others, and the planet, they have to understand how they work, what their biology. They have also to understand how the world works, and they have to understand that there are powerful forces that are not aligned with their best interest. Okay, and typically, and you said it very nicely in your report, they have to understand that all sorts of ads are not there for making them feel good, but for making them become consumers of goods that may not improve their health, on just the opposite, and may not improve the health of the planet. And so instead of just being passive consumers, they have to become active citizens. And talking about citizens, maybe they can imagine. I think to feed the imagination, you have to go both back and understand history in order to project better in the future. You have to understand where we come from, where we are, in order to dream of where we want to go. And where we come from, when we talk about citizenship, was born, the very idea was born in Athens. And at that time, a whole package was invented, a package of democracy, citizenship, education, philosophy, science, arts, and debates of quality. But there were lots of people that were not having access to that wonderful package. Women, and I'm glad that there is so many women on this panel, young people, they were not citizens, foreigners, they were not citizens, slaves, they were not citizens. And we reinvented that whole package after we've invented the printing press during the Enlightenment period. And again, the very same people were still not considered citizens. It was still, the powerful white adult male that was in charge of making decisions. The human rights were just men's rights initially. Okay, and it took years for women to get rights. It took years for slaves to get rights. It took years for the poor people to be allowed to vote. But to this date, the young people still cannot vote. And they're still not citizens in the full sense of the term. And the Greek invented the citizenship at the city level. During the Enlightenment, we invented citizenship at the national level. But today we have to invent citizenship at the global level. So I think we have to invent simultaneously, global citizenship and make sure that the youth are driving force in that global citizenship and that they are a full part of the conversation from day one, so that we can reinvent these notions of, I would say, fractal citizenship, at all scales. And, we've heard from Almaz that, she's very involved at our school level, and then at the regional level, and the national level, and now at the international level. But I think we have to be able to empower this. And indeed, as Alexiane was saying, we have to build the digital tools to empower, because lots of digital tools today are, the AI of social networks is actually abusing our weaknesses rather than empowering our strengths. Okay? And you have to be aware of these sorts of things. And so we have to redesign the digital ecosystem and the civic ecosystem to make sure that the youth can have a voice, and their voice can be the one that, drives the next generations. But as Lelia was saying it very nicely, I think we have a responsibility so that the various generations should co-construct this environment that can empower and open the imagination of the youth, so that they can start to dream, and they should not just dream alone. If you realize that your dream is not just yours, but there is many others that have the same dreams, you can start building, maybe through a GPS of dreams, the ability to come together and do together things that you could not do alone. And that's exactly what we need at the moment, because the powerful forces that we have to fight are so strong that unless we join forces, we'll not be able to have the change at the right scale.
Thank you so much, Francois. Very powerful words. And I love the way you put it all in historical perspective while still looking towards a new and completely different future. So much food for thought. I'm sure the other participants will have a lot to say about that as well. Thank you so much to our panelists. I would like to go now to our discussant, Anthony Costello, who is my dear colleague and the senior author on the report that I outlined earlier, and who has been working on the issue of child health for many years, a long and illustrious career. Anthony, based on everything that you've heard today about how we can better include and involve children and young people in discussions about their health, and these new perspectives that our panelists have opened up for us, how do you think this has enriched or deepened or changed even your thoughts about child health, and particularly the findings of our Commission's report? Anthony.
Thank you so much, and thank you to the panelists. I've never been on a panel where people have been so concise and getting across such powerful points. I just want to make a very few brief points because we want to get on to questions. First, on the threat. We're at 1.2 degrees of climate change right now, and many people believe we should not go above 1.5. So the next decade is very important. And I think the early impacts are going to be around food security, heat stress, and also migration, which will become a big political issue, I think, in the next 20 years. And as your panelists have said, this is very much linked to social and economic inequalities, employment. So we're on a knife edge, and the next decade is absolutely vital, and we need children to have a voice. So on that second point of voice, Lelia emphasized the value of talking, and also that adolescents have been hugely neglected. When I was at WHO, I used to get really tired of going to meeting after meeting where people said, oh, adolescents are so important, but no one was investing in them. No one was investing in their opportunity. I've spent a lifetime doing research on women's groups and men's groups in poorer countries in Asia and Africa. And they're enormously valuable. We've shown it through big trials that they can reduce mortality rates, improve nutrition, all kinds of impacts, actually reduce things like diabetes and the like. Alexiane said, do you have a mentor? And it's absolutely important. So if you get people together in small groups with a mentor, you can touch on some of the abstract thoughts that she was saying happens after about 12 or 13. And also in small groups of younger children, their sensitivity to nature. Taryn talked about indigenous people, and my experience of working with indigenous people in India taught me that they have so much to teach me about how to live a sustainable life. And I think the importance of casting off shame and stigma that she talked about is relevant to everybody in France, in my country, about post-colonial vulnerable groups. On Friday, I was on a podcast with a Black comedian who's an anti-vaxxer. And we had a fantastic discussion, and it came out that really a lot of the reasons that Black and minority ethnic groups were a bit anti-vaccination was why trust institutions that have abused, discriminated, and been racist in the past. And so this is all part of the healing process. And as Francois said, we must understand our history of exploitation, particularly by men, by the wealthy, and by political elites. Third point is on protection through regulation. We do face enormous commercial exploitation, not just tobacco, alcohol, but also junk food, formula milks, gambling, as you said, Sarah, theft of children's data by social media companies, which I think is an enormous issue, actually. And we must remember we're up against very vested capital and corporate interests, and that we need to be very strategic. I think we can target privacy rights for children and also anti-monopolies. But one thing we must remember is we must be strategic, we must be persistent, and we must be brave. Finally, I would like to emphasize optimism. Almaz started us off. She said she is hopeful. And I agree with that. Things, I've been in this game for a long time. So I think things are much better in many ways than 30 years ago for young people and generally. I don't think we should despair. Yes, we face tipping points in the climate, but there are bad and good ones. I think we're on the cusp of a renewable tipping point, which renewables are now cheaper than most fossil fuels. On population growth, I think we'll plateau by mid-century. Education and communications are much, much better. Sarah will be pleased about the change in US leadership, which now gives us hope to have a much more coordinated global approach to climate change. And finally, health in all policies. That means that all of us have a role in health. It's not just about doctors and nurses. It's in every single sector. So whatever you go on to do in your career, you can have an impact on health and well-being of children. So I'll just leave you with one thought. It's a message I always quote, which is a phrase from Dr. B.K. Ambedkar, who was a very low caste lawyer who rose up to write the Indian Constitution in the late 1940s. And he just used a 3-word phrase. He said to all his people, the low caste, downtrodden people of India, he said, educate, agitate, mobilize. And I got the message from all of our speakers today that young people can be brilliant at doing those 3 things: educate, agitate, mobilize. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Anthony, for bringing together these different threads brought up by our panelists and by ending it with such a concise conclusion. I think that educate, agitate, mobilize really sums up a lot about what was brought up by our panelists. And it's also concrete, it's action verbs. It's things that we can all take on ourselves. And so I think that's very inspiring. I really enjoyed hearing from all of our panelists, and I think our audience has too. So we have a few questions from the audience that have come in via YouTube and other platforms. So I would like to put some of them to our panelists, and I encourage anyone who is listening right now to please go ahead and share your questions, and we will get them answered by the panelists. So I think the very first question that came in was directed towards Almaz. And the questioner said, your presentation was amazing. How can other students get involved? So I think since we're talking about educate, agitate, mobilize, this is going to be one of the most important questions. So Almaz, how can other students get involved?
Thank you for that question. That's such a great question. I think firstly, you need to educate yourself, which I'm sure you've already done, and read policy so that you can notice the injustice in your community and start taking action. You need to be vocal and express your opinions. I think the second step is to organize yourself with your peers and join lobbying groups. This may even be debating clubs. And I think you should never second guess yourself, because if you're passionate and want good for the people and for the youth, you can never be wrong. And I always remember this one quote, if you don't try, nothing will ever happen. And I think that applies to the climate change situation and youth expressing their opinions.
Thank you so much, Almaz. Great answer and very practical steps that youths or really anyone can take to become more involved. And I like what you said about never second guessing yourselves. There's echoes about things that Taryn said and Alexian said and other panelists said about building self-confidence and understanding that everyone has a role to play here. Let's go to Roy's question. Roy asks of particularly Lilia and Francois, do you have any thoughts on information dissemination mechanisms that can help increase the visibility of evidence to all stakeholders, especially parents and teachers? So how do we concretely build those bridges and links between whatever scientific evidence might exist and the people who are really interacting with youths on a daily basis? Maybe first Francois and then Lilia.
Oh, I think Lilia can start.
Okay, Lilia.
Okay, thank you, Francois. So thank you for this really, really interesting question. So I think that we have to be confident actually now, today, how we gather information will be through internet, through discussions. So some years before, or in some regions or country, what you would teach a child was how to fish in the river, how to gather food on trees, you know. So I mean, we are not going to live, I mean, all the planet population is not going to live like this anymore, but our daily environment is to be in the internet, also to gather information. So that is exactly the same thing as teaching to a child how to fish when he's living in his natural outside world, you know. So I really think that adults need to know that they are models and that they need to allow children to have time just to watch what they are doing. And that echoes something really interesting, is that children are overworked. They are always at school, always busy, always having activities, and they have not time, I mean, Western children at least, to just be with adults and look what they are doing. And what is a healthy life for adults right now, and towards information and evidence-based information? It's just to be checking on the internet, to compare sites, to look for opinions, and to be able to change our minds and to change our behaviors. So if the child is seeing the teacher and the parents talk about issues, debate, look for more information, and be ready to change habits as soon as there is some new information saying like, look, you should eat something else of this because, I don't know, like meat is destroying the environment. Okay, let's go for something else, you know. And I think that if children look and see adults doing this, they will really feel confident to shift their behaviors and to be more reactive.
Thank you very much, Lilia. Over to you, Francois.
Yeah, thanks. And to complete what Lilia was saying, you know, in the old days, you also had to learn, you know, that this fungi is a poisonous one, or that, you know, this predator is dangerous for you. Okay, and there is indeed on the internet both, you know, very positive things, but also things that are predatory or parasitic that can manipulate you and, you know, harm you in many ways. Okay, and so you have to be aware of this. And I think, you know, since we've invented at least language, we've developed critical thinking. But critical thinking can be only enhanced by a decent education. And maybe, you know, that has always been true. But I think it's even more true today, and we have to design new ways that maybe are not only individual critical thinking skills, but collective ones. Okay, and by this I mean, you know, we see the spread of fake news, and how do we know when we receive an information whether it's a real news or a fake news? Okay, if someone else has already fact-checked it, and you know, some journalists are doing it, but if you don't know that they've done it, you don't know that this is a fake news. And yet we could build a digital infrastructure that tells you, oh, some journalists or some scientists or some schools or some educators, some kids have doubts about this information. Okay, so imagine if we were building a digital infrastructure which would have a sort of a AAA for the quality of information we receive. Just to give you an example, you're receiving information about the climate. Is it a fake news? Is it science? Is it appropriate for a kid of a certain age? We could have, you know, the scientist perspective on this. we could have the teacher perspective on this, and we could have the teens or the young ones perspective on this. And if a content as a AAA, where both the young ones and the adults agree that this is part of the most relevant information, that would be very valuable. And you could do the same. You receive an ad on tobacco. Okay, we know this is bad for you. We know this is bad for people around you, and this is going to be bad for the environment because your cigarette butt is very toxic. Okay, but we don't have this information at hand when we receive an ad that tries to mobilize us and turn us into a smoking person. And so if we were doing systematic things, and if we were not allowing advertisements that damage you, damage the environment, and damage the others systematically, we could ban things. And that's where, it's not only a question of information flow, it's also a matter of policy, as Anthony was saying. We should be able to, there is some countries where, cigarette ads are forbidden, and others where it's not. And that's immoral. At the global scale, we should put pressure on these predatory companies that are making money on the health of children, on the health of adults, and on the health of our environment. And I think we can come together and not only share information, but also share the best way to engage and mobilize and find ways to change the policies, not only at the local scale, but at the global scale. And that's one of the issues we face today. We don't have a place for global policy discussion. Honestly, the United Nations is not working as it should. And it's certainly not listening enough to the younger ones. Okay, so there's still reports like the one you've done with WHO and UNICEF and Lancet that shows that something could be done. And in fact, you are inviting us to come together in that report. And that's very interesting to see that, in fact, what we need is what can be called a middle ground between the upper ground of the institution that you've represented in that report and the underground activists like Almas, Alexian. We have to find a place where we can come together and define what are our priorities, what is healthy for us, what is healthy for others, what is healthy for the planet.
Thank you so much, Francois and Lilia, for those valuable inputs to the question. I think gives us a lot to think about. And rebounding a bit off of both of what you just said, a question now about the tools that we can use to actually enact some of these relationships between children and adults and between really all people to build this world that we are all working towards. So it's a question for Alexian and Taryn about digital mentoring, because you both mentioned how digital tools can be used, especially in the COVID-19 era, to reach out. But we've also heard about how digital tools can abuse weaknesses instead of empowering strengths. That's Francois's phrase that I think is very well put. So how do you see digital tools as countering some of these forces? And particularly when it comes to mentoring, what do you think is the future of digital mentoring, both during this COVID-19 pandemic and in the era that will follow afterwards? Let's go to Alexian first and then Taryn.
Thank you for this question, because it was also the starting point of the digital mentoring launch from AFEB. It is a new program. It was launched in panic in the emergency context of the first lockdown in France between March to May. And the question that all schools asked us afterwards was, how do we organize ourselves to continue this program for the next academic year, 2020-2021? And well, the answer, this question was unexpected. So AFEV worked the whole summer to find first appropriate tools to mobilize mentors. So we used digital platforms, social media, but the sine qua non condition was first to train mentors before they would meet their mentee, and to also raise awareness about the fact that some families do not speak French. They do not necessarily have a computer or appropriate, technological equipment, so that mentoring would maybe only be carried via phone, like I did for Melissa, my mentee. So basically a part of the training was also devoted to giving them tools about what activities can be conducted by a phone, or if the mentee also has a computer. So the aim of mentoring is not to be again at school. The mentor is only here for the mentee, to empower the mentee, to listen to what the mentee has to say. And I read in the chat that sometimes it is difficult to find tools or ideas of activities that are close to the reality of people, like living in Saint-Denis, for instance, in a suburb of Paris. So to counterbalance the dangers of using digital tools, and especially the fact that some families cannot explain to their children how to properly use internet, to not believe everything that is written there, we actually also propose some specific training for both the mentors and the mentee. It's going to be launched next week, actually, the first round of these trainings. And the second idea is also under discussion right now, is to include parents in this training with their children and the mentors. So AFEV is currently thinking about not only a duo between the mentor and the mentee, but also thinking about how to include better the family in this process, so that the family is also educated towards the danger of internet or social medias, among other dangers. But the fact that families could be also included in this special relationship would make mentoring first more concrete to them, and they would also feel maybe more inclined in thinking about the subject the mentors talk about with the mentee, such as maybe climate change. Hope I answered the question.
Yes, that's wonderful. Thank you, Alexiane. Taryn, please, let's hear from you about this question of digital mentoring and the future of digital mentoring.
Oh, absolutely. And just not to repeat, certainly great points I think that Alexiane's actually covered, but it's really understanding the ecosystem also that sits around young people and the way in which mentoring works, that we can all be mentors. And so our digital tools, I guess, that we've developed over 16 years have often been videos and bringing the mentors to the mentees via, exciting interviews and pushing, I guess, also the idea of not dumbing down content and ensuring that the content that we provide young people is really informative and engaging. And we have a particular position as an organisation to not use too much social media. We have YouTube, but we don't use Instagram, we don't use Facebook, and we don't use Twitter as an organisation, because we are really trying to disrupt the idea that there has been, I guess, a change to attention span of young people over this time, and that we are hoping to be able to create mentors that do create those connections that are a bit more long lasting and create the discussion around complex ideas. So there's lots of tools that we've developed as an organisation, but particularly I think in this digital age, it is acknowledging, as Alexiane has said, that digital access is not always easy for all people, and particularly for kids experiencing marginalisation or from countries and parts of the world that have a digital divide. So we've tried audio and also paper-based snail mail that is also relevant in this time still, because there's just simply not the infrastructure in many countries that will enable that access. So it's continual planning, I think, outside of the COVID context to ensure that we still raise the issues of digital inaccessibility, importantly, and also media literacy, I think, in that.
Thank you so much, Taryn, for that perspective. I think it's really valuable. A lot of times we think of digital solutions as kind of the only way forward, and it's easy to forget that a lot of people don't have access to those solutions, and that there are other ways of organizing that have traditionally been very powerful in the past and of reaching out to people. Also very interesting, your point about attention span and not using some of the most commonly used social networks. I think that's a very interesting deliberate choice for AIM to have made. And I think it gives us some food for thought over here. Another question. Yes, Almaz, please go ahead.
Could I offer a South African context on the whole issue of educating people online? I think this question was so important because we see, and COVID definitely exposed this, is that if you're not in the digital economy, you're left behind. And we definitely saw this in the education sector during the COVID pandemic. And I've seen it firsthand in South Africa, where we participated in model legislature debates, and some kids didn't have data to even log on. And I think it's so important to give all children equal access to the digital economy.
Thank you so much, Almaz. It's really important to hear that kind of perspective. And I think that it's true. A lot of times people plan these activities just assuming that everyone can log on to their high-speed internet with their data account. And it's just not true for a lot of people. And I think, thank you for bringing up that experience. It's really good to hear again and again how we need to keep thinking about these issues. We have another question from the audience. I think this one is a good one because it forces us to engage with different audiences. So the question is that the Lancet report, the report that I was talking about earlier, it focused on commercial marketing and the harms that commercial actors and businesses can pose to children through some of their different activities. And so the audience member asked, what would you say to business leaders? How can business leaders be involved in this agenda and improving the world for children? And I'd like to turn that question first to Almaz and then to Anthony. So Almaz, what do you think? How can business leaders be involved in improving the world for children?
I think business leaders, more than anything, need to offer funding so that everyone can be included. And I think they should seek opinion from people from all different backgrounds, especially people from disadvantaged backgrounds, so that we can have a holistic view. And I also think that, for example, businesses like Facebook, they earn so much money, and I feel like they give so little back. And if we could make a policy that just for a certain amount that they make, they could give that back to maybe the UN to use in various initiatives, I think that would be such a good idea to implement.
Thank you so much, Almaz. I think that is really clear and a very good policy suggestion. Anthony, over to you.
Look, I think business can be both our opponents, but also our allies. I mean, businesses drive the world economy and create employment, etc. I'll give you two examples. One is, you know, I'm a pediatrician, child health doctor, and take Nestle. So they're a big Swiss company, and I've been opposed to many of the formula milk companies because they break the WHO code on promotion of breast milk substitutes like formula milks. And I was asked to chair a panel with the Nestle chief executive at a sustainable food forum. And I was in two minds, but I agreed to do it. And I met him. And in the public, I said, look, I've been wholly opposed. But we were talking about sustainability. And actually, Nestle, on the scores that are now given to all companies, are actually very progressive when it comes to zero carbon. And in public, I got him to state, and he said, we will be zero carbon by 2030. They take a much longer term view of their business. The other example is insurance and banks have been getting this for a long time. Some of the best reports on climate change have come out of the big banks over the last 2 decades. And again, I met once at a meeting with the chief executive of quite a big insurance company called Aviva, and he was into sustainability. And one of the problems we discussed was the short-term view of the stock markets, that they every 3 months they had to report their results, and then there's the whole casino of gambling on shares, whether they're long or short and all the rest of it. And he said, you know, if we made it law for companies to only report annually, it would enable chief executives to take a longer term view. And interestingly, 6 months later, he was fired because the stock market had gone down. And it brought home to me that, you know, business people are often in a very difficult conundrum between trying to satisfy shareholders, but also taking a much longer term view. So again, we have to be strategic and persistent, work with good people on the business side, and there are many of them, and try and find a way through, and particularly to try and control the financialization of our whole economy. That companies that make things and organize things are basically doing a good thing. People gambling with money the whole time are not.
Thank you so much, Anthony and Almaz, for those perspectives. Anthony, what you were just saying about how business leaders can be both our opponents and our allies, that reminds me a lot of the words of one of my favorite activists in the United States context, Mariam Kaba, who works on prison abolition. And she talks about having no permanent allies and no permanent enemies, and about how you work with people on individual issues. So someone can be your ally when it comes to carbon footprint and making sustainable business decisions, but you may not agree on all the other issues. So I really agree with that. Thank you. I would like to move from this very sort of hard-headed discussion of business leaders to something that both Francois and Taryn brought up, which is the power and importance of imagination in addressing the biggest challenges faced by children and adults today. And speaking as a public health scientist, as a scientist, it may be a little bit difficult for some people to understand and to grasp. So I wonder if each of you could talk a little bit more concretely for the more literal minded among us about how we can harness the power of imagination to make the kinds of changes that are needed today. So why don't we first go to Taryn and then to Francois?
Sure. I think particularly we at AIM have looked over 16 years at what is the magic that happens between a mentor and a mentee, and that can be really simple in terms of human connection when that's enabled through COVID safety, but when that's limited, we are having to reimagine these worlds and also the people within the ecosystem around young people and how they might make those changes, big and small. So I guess we've also referred often to the work of Sir Ken Robinson in creativity and thought about the discussion and discourse around imagination and really understanding the inner child and the way in which young children, particularly preschool, just have ways of thinking, being, knowing and doing, and just being able to really look into that and how that is lost in very structured and institutional environments, and that we can disrupt that and create powerful ways, creative ways, and think about artists and musicians and all of the people, I guess, over time that have contributed towards raising social issues that have sometimes sat out of very traditional institution and environment. So the imagination agenda for AIM, but for the world is so important now, because we've continued, I guess, to look at the same kind of solutions for years that are just simply not working, and to acknowledge the broken systems really do need the reimagining. But particularly young people can bring that, but we also need our inner child, I think, to sometimes be open to new ideas.
Thank you so much, Taryn. I love your mention of bringing in artists and musicians. I think that's a great way to bring people together, and also to put forward some of these ideas that may not enter the discourse in other ways. Francois, what do you think?
Thank you, Sarah. I think, imagination is one of the most powerful force to shape the future. And it links even to business leaders. If they can imagine that there'll be a campaign that can destroy their whole company reputation because they've not treated children well, maybe they will start changing their policy. Again, if you look back at the history of 19th century capitalists, they had no problem sending children in mines because that was part of their business model. But today it would be not possible to do these sorts of things anymore, and so I think we can start putting pressure on them, and it depends on the storytelling power that we have. But in order to foster imagination, obviously artists are key. They are very powerful at triggering our imagination by stimulating theirs, and I think that we can do this even with children. Okay, so one of the things that we've done at the Learning Planet level is we've partnered with the Saint-Exupéry Foundation and the UNESCO to launch a writing contest where the Little Prince of Saint-Exupéry was coming back during the lockdown and was having a serious conversation or a fun conversation with a child that was going through the harsh time that we know of, and what would be their conversation. Okay, and that was completely open, and we got participants from 4 to 25-year-old that contributed to this. Okay, and we'll be publishing the 60 best, and the 6 finalists will be presented and tomorrow. And the 6, why 6? Because there are 6 UN languages. So we got participants in 6 UN languages across the globe that have contributed. And that's, I think, one powerful way, because we are very strange animals in a way. Okay, we can believe in things that are completely imaginary only if everyone else believes in it. Then suddenly it becomes really important. That's the case of money. That's the case of diploma. That's the case of so much, gods and many other things we believe in. And so if we believe we can build a better future, then I think that can become a self-fulfilling prophecy. But we have to be able to build new narrative, because when I read many of the books that my children were reading, most of them were about collapse of the future. Whereas if we were to invite the children of today to, like the Little Prince, draw me a planet, okay, what would be your planet of the future? If you go to another planet, what would it look like? So that's what the Little Prince, I think, is evoking, is this ability to go out of our inner planet and maybe go in ourselves and go deep enough to realize, what's truly meaningful for us and what it is that we can do together that we cannot do alone. And I think imagination and narratives can have these very powerful mobilizing forces. And so I think it's very nice to try to keep doing these sorts of things, keep inviting children to talk to the Little Prince and, talk to their inner selves and their imaginations and free it, so that, they can go much beyond the existing constraints. And then, I think they will need some science and some technology and some, social change, but that's in a way come second. First, you have to broaden the imagination. Then you can progressively play with, the constraints of today, which may become the opportunity of tomorrow.
Thank you so much, Francois. Really inspiring, and I think that everyone should check out the Little Prince stories when they're available at the Learning Planet website. I think that you've really spoken well about the power of story and of imagination to in this process that we're talking about of making a better world. So thank you both. I think we have time for 2 more questions. One I'll direct towards one of the panelists, and then I would like each of the panelists to respond to the second one. The first question is about, as I mentioned, our report called for a global movement for children. And we really think that that's necessary today because, as Anthony said, a lot of gains have been made in child health and well-being, but also the challenges that we're facing are huge. And so the audience member would like to know, how do we build a global movement for child welfare while at the same time empowering local communities to take child welfare into their own hands in their own specific context, because it's a big world and there's a lot of different situations out there. So I'm just going to ask one panelist to answer this question, and that is Almaz. And that's because she has, I think, out of all of us, the most experience working at both local levels within her school and, as Francois was saying, providing input to legislation at national level and also working at global level. So Almaz, how do you think that we can build a global movement for children while at the same time empowering local communities to act in ways that are appropriate? Almaz.
So I think this is a very complex question. On the global context, I think there are already many organizations like the UN, UNESCO, UNICEF that work on a global context. And if we could bring them into our local communities, for example, if we could have the UN working in South Africa, that I think that would be great. And in a local context, I think that we have organizations, for example, in South Africa, there's the SIA, the South African Institute of International Affairs, that work specifically, I think, with the youth of South Africa to try and empower us. And I think to create a strong local community, we need to look at their specific context. For example, we can't look at first world ideas and dump them on third world countries, or it works in the other direction, take third world ideas and put them in first world countries. So I think this is a very complex question, but I think within our local communities, people like young people could even try and influence the agenda of their governments and take into consideration their culture, because I think as some of the panelists mentioned, culture is such an important part in solving the climate crisis, because it's different for every country.
Thank you so much, Almaz. I really like that idea of looking both how global organizations can be more anchored and can act more locally, and also how local organizations can build up strong communities with the ideas from those local places, and not just transplanting ideas from somewhere else. So I'd like to finish with one final question for all panelists. And this is from the audience, an audience member, and I really appreciate the question, so thank you. The audience member says, thank you so much for the hope and optimism that you have provided here today. And they say, pointing at the issues and solutions ahead, how can we go from just discussing these topics among ourselves, meaning among people who already agree that climate change is a big issue and who already may belong to similar networks and are having these discussions? How can we broaden the conversation to bring in other people who are not necessarily part of that conversation today? So first, I'd like to go to Francois. How can we broaden the conversation around these issues?
Well, thank you. I think it's a key issue, of course. I think there is different ways of doing it. One is to show that this issue is related to different complementary issues. Okay? So typically, maybe I don't care about climate, but I do care about gender equality, or I do care about poverty or health. And it happens that the United Nations has built the Sustainable Development Goals, the 17 dimensions, and have shown their connectedness. So I think that's one way of doing it. Another way, I think, is to invite people to start celebrating what is the most meaningful to them in terms of the way they've progressed on one of those issues. And that's what we try to do within the Learning Planet context. We try to invite people to celebrate how they've learned to care for themselves, others, and the planet, and start to see all those connections. And when you celebrate what you've learned, you're likely to celebrate who helped you to learn. Maybe it's a mentor, maybe it's a teacher, maybe it's a friend, maybe it's a peer, maybe it's Wikipedia, maybe it's a game, maybe it's a walk in nature. But what we do know is that celebrating and developing reflexivity is the best way to develop the ability to learn how to learn, and therefore being able to engage with ever more complex issues. So celebrating your first step on the path is the best way to start willing to walk maybe for miles and miles. So I think that's another very important issue. And the third thing I think is to realize that what are our deepest values? Okay, and some anthropologists like Jonathan Haidt have worked on this, and they've highlighted that what is the most common to all of us is we want things that are fair and things where we care. Okay, if we were not caring, we would not be here. If no one had cared for us when we were born, we would not have survived. So we are very vulnerable species, and we have to care for each other. And so the caring is very important. And so if you realize that there is things that are uncaring, that are harmful, and if you realize that there is things that are unfair, okay, and they are both unfair and harmful, then people feel that something should be done. And if we start realizing this, we can start mobilizing. And I will soon have to leave you because we are moving to another session dedicated to what will happen if we were giving kids the right to ask for new rights. And I think that's another way of mobilizing globally, is to invite children. Children have, there is a UN Declaration of Children's Rights, but in that declaration, there is not the right to ask for new rights. Okay, and that's very weird. And if we were giving, Almas and her generation the right to ask for new rights, what would they be asking for? Probably they would be asking for, climate justice. Probably they'll be asking for, many other things which would be interesting. But so maybe we have to find the way where we can all align and all feel comfortable. And, we should try to work on, what's unfair and what's harmful. And, how do we build this common movement? And we ask for new rights, so that rights not only at the local level but also at the global level, because at the moment the harm is very often global harm, and we can't escape it. So we have to be able to ask for new rights at that global scale, and it starts with the individual, but it's the individual embedded in communities. And the other things Haidt says is communities have authorities and sacredness embedded in them. Okay, so what is the authority for the global human species? What is the most sacred values for the whole human species? And I feel, it's caring for the next generation. And maybe we can all agree on something like this, and then we can try to align and do things together that we could not do alone. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Francois. And I really encourage everyone to join this next session on giving children the right to ask for new rights. So please do join once we finish up here. I would now like to ask the other participants in just 30 seconds, given that we only have a small amount of time remaining, how can we broaden this discussion to communities that may not necessarily have been brought in to the discussion already? And now I'd like to go to Lelia.
Thank you, Sarah. So first, we have to be aware that vulnerable populations are very interested in climate change. One common idea was to think that it's a first world problem, and that if you are, worried about food or education or your family's future, then the planet's future is not important for you. So we know research told us that this is not true, actually. If you ask to those vulnerable people, like ethnic minorities or lower income people, they are even more worried about climate change than the other ones. Why? Because they know that they will not be prioritized probably when decisions has to be made. So actually, if you work with really vulnerable population, I would just advise to raise the question, because what we know is that they're really worried, but they do not trust themselves to open the question. So raise a question and learn to them that advocacy starts where you are. So you can advocate at your own school, you can advocate in your own community. And as François said, it will help you to care to yourself, about your family, your community, and the planet.
Thank you so much, Lilias. Just raise the question and remembering that vulnerable communities are supremely interested. So now let's go to Alexiane. Quickly, Alexiane, how can we broaden the conversation?
How can we broaden the conversation is an idea I've had by implementing a new program. Basically, in like disadvantaged suburbs, there are students who are living with families. It's a whole apartment or a whole bunch of apartments, which are basically meant to become a whole family. So that projects are initiated, mentors are mentoring their mentees face to face. And all of the projects that they develop together, such as board games, or such as online games or discussion or debates, or event put forward at the national level. Basically, FF is collecting all of these discussions, all of these local initiatives, and they make the local communities' voices heard at a next level when we participate to conference or when we built Collectif Mentorat, which is 8 associations together and we're meeting so that it's an exchange of practices, of ideas. So basically it's a bottom-up approach, and this is a very concrete answer.
Thank you so much. I love it. Now let's go to Taryn. How can we broaden the conversation?
I think representation's been covered, but and definitely thinking of underrepresented people that may not be in the discussion, but more broadly building bridges between unlikely alliances, I'd like to say is my suggestion, because we very frequently think of the likely alliances, and I think picking up on the discussion earlier of where there's different ethical behaviours of corporates that you can maybe have one solution that you work on together. There's definitely more than corporates, and there's definitely more than the macro level solutions at the local level. It's also forging unlikely alliances and conversations.
Thank you so much. Unlikely alliances. I think that's a great way to take this forward. Anthony, briefly, how can we broaden the conversation?
Mute. I'd just say really 3 things. First, use small group discussions on podcasts and Zoom. Invite yourself onto all kinds of different cultural groups and just get chats going about climate change, children and the like, and make it fun. Second, link to positive things in your community, especially around greening the environment, because there are a lot of things you can do with gardens and flowers and trees and stuff like that, which gets everyone, children, families involved. And thirdly, be quite specific and time bound. So for example, this year is COP26, which is where all the countries will come up with their national decarbonisation commitments. So I think it would be very interesting to get local groups, local politicians together to discuss that and what the national target should be, and then send these views to your local MPs and put pressure on them, because that's a very specific something that we could do this year.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Anthony, for those very concrete suggestions. And I will give the last word to Almaz. Almaz, how can we broaden the conversation?
I think the answer to this question is social media and utilizing the digital economy. For example, in South Africa, SAIA, they brought together people from all over South Africa to debate online during the pandemic, and people came from all across to join, people from the grassroots levels. And in debates, for example, on food security, we had such a diversity of views because we had people from affluent backgrounds who were worrying about food waste. And we had people from more disadvantaged backgrounds who were worrying about actually having food to eat. And I think we need more funding in these sorts of organizations that do this so that we can harness the power of social media.
Thank you so much, Almaz. I think that that's a great way to end this topic as we're all joining virtually today, and many of us use social media to have these types of conversations. Unfortunately, we're out of time. I wish we could keep going and continue, but I want to encourage others to go to the next panel on children's rights. I really appreciated the time of the panelists and the audience members for their excellent questions. And I loved how this was a hopeful conversation. It really shows how many people care about these issues and how they're coming at the issues of children's health, well-being, and welfare from different angles. And it's really something that unites people from all around the globe. And so these kinds of conversations, like the ones that we're having today, and hopefully that all of us will continue to have with our friends and loved ones and colleagues, this is the kind of thing that can make a difference, as we've heard from all of our panelists. And we've gotten some new techniques and thoughts about how to do that as well. So thank you all so much again. I look forward to continuing this conversation with all of you, and see you in the next panel, I hope, and have a great afternoon, morning, or evening. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.